Whitaker, if you please.
Good morning. I hope you're having a great weekend. The reading today was chosen by Bill Harlan, and it was written by our very own speaker today, Ray Rankin. It's called Laid Down to Sleep. If I'm gone before you wake, I'll frame the sky in hills for you, a divertisement to be sure of should I die before you do. But if I sleep as you waken, it won't begrudge what might have been had we been more favored. That lucky to have lived at the time we died, we luck into each day of birth, and once we reach that first birthday and revel in the rich details, that will be our luckiest day. Or are we two both luckier yet to die before we live, lucky enough to claim that date and then see it through before we did? That rolling over we both awake and gaze to far horizon, distant hills still framed in your eyes. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Enjoy the service.
By way of introduction, I'd like to maybe start with a line from the first book, the first poem in Ray's book, which is The Rain After It's Gone by Raymond Morris Rankin. So thank you, Raymond Morris. The Rain After It's Gone. And I said, well, bring some, and you might sell a few. And he thought that would be a little tacky. Available on Amazon.com and in fine bookstores that might possibly have it. The first poem is Azazel's Lot. And the first line is, what in hell does the poet want? Please help me welcome Ray Rankin.
Thank you for that introduction, Bill. I am glad to be here. I was a little worried about the presentation, so I called a friend and read it to him, and it seemed to go well. There was a respectful silence at the end until I started hearing snoring. I read it to my wife, Pat, and she did not go to sleep, so there's promise here, I tell you. Good morning. Show of hands, please. Have any of you guys been to the Parthenon in Athens? I hope to someday, to discover for myself the reason that people come from all around the globe to see it. Its aesthetics beguile me. I've read that its 9:4 proportions balance the austere with the delicate, earthly with the divine. But there's more to its aesthetics, there must be. Otherwise, aesthetics reduces to architecture. For example, the Acropolis is also a symbol of human aspiration to not be forgotten. And yet it's a ruin. Decay being its other architect. It's a weather-beaten stonework falling apart in a quite specific aesthetic of decay, one that we recognize. All creations, all achievements perish. This is no fatalism, but a surety instead, one that we all share. The Acropolis is a human relic of ageless grace, glorious as a child's kite floating in the air, but just as fleeting and futile. Show of hands again. How many of you have hiked Pine Mountain Trail? Me too. Many times, in fact. But it does beg the question, why drive 45 minutes just to hike it when I could walk the same 5 miles starting from my doorstep? Well, of course, it's not the same 5 miles. There's a topology involved, one that the trail encodes, and that my body interprets, much as a phonograph needle reads a record. My feet, knees, hips, and spine translate the trail in succession, in real time, the ups and the downs, as well as the rocks that trip me. Then my body assembles it into meaning, a meaning not stored in the brain. I came for this kinesthetic experience, one that's all the more meaningful for its lack of words. Language, likewise, encodes experience into a landscape of sound. See where I'm going here? First off, we think with language. For me, English, though I do envy you multilinguists out there. But here's my point, and yes, I really do have one. Thinking pre-exists language. Babies think in utero. Imagine their WTFs after being swatted across the butt and tossed into this rackety, overbright world. Set a couple one-year-olds together and watch them. They'll yak away, babbling, sure, but they pause at appropriate times, showing every sign of understanding each other. I say they do. I say they're using the same oral architecture, the rhythms, harmonies, meters, parallelisms even, that we adults use to deliver meaning. Consider Ring Around the Rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. What does that mean? Experts have ventured interpretations, but Dylan Thomas, whose mother read him the Mother Goose rhymes long before he understood words, said he comprehended the recitations as their intrinsic meaning. And I agree. Consider, too, the King James Bible. Few could read in 1611, so the English scholars had scribes recite their translations back to them. Then, based on sonics alone, would rewrite the passages, then have them recited one more time, doing this over and over till they arrived at the most evocative sound possible. And it became the world's biggest seller for a reading audience, not a listening one. Coincidence? I think not. Faithful translation was critical, of course, but rousing listeners was more so. Here's my case. Euphony, ear-pleasing sound, is our preferred method of delivering meaning because aesthetics is what lures meaning into our minds. During the same time period, William Shakespeare, the greatest English writer, worked exclusively in oral forms, drama, poetry. Whence his greatness? I suggest that incantatory writing is far more likely to transcend the vagaries of time. We unconsciously respond to the cadence, the harmonic, the rhythmic, the polyrhythmic, the, you guessed it, incantatory. In large part, that's because it's a shared architecture, unchanged largely since Homo sapiens first uttered words. And it's a heritage we share with cave dwellers, what it means to be human. I've been told that I explain things to within an inch of their life, but I'm going to risk it. Point one, our forebears built language up from the pre-existing rhythms of their grunts and moans, massaging and parsing them over eons into meaning, so that language could encompass the breadth of their experience. Indeed, breadth of experience and language expand in lockstep, necessarily so. Nonetheless, meaning is a function of that ancient guttural landscape from which it arose. It's Keats's insight in Ode on a Grecian Urn. Beauty is truth. Truth, beauty. Beauty is truth. Truth, beauty. Point two, mind, including rationality, and empiricism especially, must conform to nature. Nature as truth is our grounding principle. And as language is the ongoing product of natural process, so language's logic is nature's also. In fact, reason itself, much as we'd like to believe that logic is somehow sacrosanct, accords to the same oral scaffolding that arose, that evolved, as we did. So the upshot is that truth as nature and Keats's truth as beauty are reciprocal. Indeed, how is it that we recognize grand truths as soon as we hear them, given there's no time for analysis, simply by their aesthetics? As Dylan Thomas contends, language architecture is the overarching meaning. Our logic adheres to the blueprints of oral aesthetics. Or, as Frank Lloyd Wright tells us, architecture must harmonize with landscape. Great poetry is timeless, but poetry can be timely and ahead of its time as well. I say poetry can address emerging truths far better than prose can, prose being ill-equipped to form up the nebulousness of what's coming to be. That's because poetry, rather than specifying, insinuates, intimates, speaks around, and otherwise brings context to the indistinct, delivering a first, if fuzzy, delineation into our cognizance. In this sense, poems enable the more prosaic explications that follow. Yeats's The Second Coming is a prime example. Prose needs poetry to lead the way. I should mention that it's poets' nature, frankly, to dare dark byways. Enigmas simply beguile them. But when poets express what's as yet unarticulated, obscurity intrudes, that most frequent complaint leveled against poetry. but it's unjust. Conundrums are part and parcel of what's utterly new. So great poems are necessarily, but not intentionally, oblique. Oblique, that is, until our zeitgeist finally catches up. Have you ever watched or read, if you're one of those who still reads, a mystery, then halfway through, you realize you have unconsciously, but not consciously, figured it out, like The Sixth Sense, perhaps, which, by the way, totally had me going. I mean, it excited me, but it galled me also. There was something going on that I was just not getting, and I knew I ought to. Yes, it's ego. I have a hard time accepting that some things are quite beyond me. Deep therapy may be indicated. But leaving that aside, this is precisely poetry's forte. Robert Graves said that poetry's either about love or death or nothing at all. His point, I think, is that poetry's well placed to find the deeply meaningful. Its emotional base, ideally suited for this task. My father's military honors funeral was a meticulous, punctilious choreography of soldiers delivering a coffin. A transport that only takes 5 minutes, but ends up taking 15. Why? It's to evince what words can't say. This means something. No minister, no eulogy. There's no making sense of death. Somehow, however, that choreography delivered the meaningfulness of what it means to live, to love, and to lose both. Poetry attempts to harmonize our quite irrational unconscious into our consciousness. Reason, despite it being the first word behind me, is not the path to enlightenment, and certainly not the path that we're on. In fact, this is why poetry sings, to clear the way for other than rational insights. It lullabies rationality, that jailer of our conscious mind, in order to slip one past him. Great poetry utilizes the opiate of irresistible language. Once our jailers are drugged, many, shall we say, irrational ideations can steal through. Then our unconscious and our consciousness can collude and can together weave a gold meaningfulness out from the straw of words. In the Middle Ages, monks preserved the ancient world knowledge on animal skins because they lasted. But the skins were labor-intensive to produce and expensive. So they often reused them, carefully scraping off the inscriptions and overwriting them. These were called palimpsest. There are things that we know, important things, without knowing how we know them. That's because our conscious mind functions as a palimpsest of our unconscious. This is the utility of poems. They focus on the indistinct, the undefined, to help this process along. Our conscious mind builds models of nature. These edifices are abstractions, of course, impressive, yes, and exceedingly useful. but unlovely. The five senses, they link us to nature. Still, there's a link more fundamental, more direct, the unconscious itself. Yet this vast reservoir of knowing remains unavailable to us till it's worded. The Greeks externalized it as the Muses, and they had a point. I contend that the unconscious is nature in microcosm. In this sense, nature's not outside, but for a lack of a better word, inside. So, to word our unconscious is to reconcile our conscious minds with nature, quite literally. We model nature, but the unconscious is nature's antecedent, and more to point, our ardency. Pre-literate societies passed knowledge on through memorization. They had no choice, and that required euphony, repetitions, parallelisms, the melodics of rhythm, meter, and rhyme, poetry's hallmarks. But euphony does more. By emphasizing the landscape of the unconscious over the models we build on it, landscape becomes the larger meaning, the larger truth. This is as it should be. Why? Because the landscape is little removed from nature, whereas language as a tool, as denotation, has diverged far. For this reason alone, any free and responsible search for truth and meaning, you use Principle 4, cannot abandon euphony. To do so divorces us from the interdependent web of all existence of which we're a part, Principle 7. To read poetry is to explore an ancient landscape, our unconscious, without the benefit of a map. Once the great explorers passed the Pillars of Hercules, they were confronted with a pathless ocean. They needed no foreknowledge. It was a matter of daring only. We will always be explorers, and mapless ones at that. And it's okay. Because, as Robert Browning told us, our reach must always exceed our grasp. Thank you. Thank you for not falling asleep.
Thank you, Ray.